Since my baby is turning 1 in a few weeks, I wanted to share her birth story 1 year later. It's actually become easier and easier to tell throughout the year. This story does include parts of trauma, so if you don't want to listen to that, it's okay. I totally get it. It all starts on June 14th. I was 34 weeks and 6 days. I started having contractions that night and they were getting really close together, so I decided to go to the hospital. Got there at midnight at exactly 35 weeks. Had contractions for 12 hours. They sent me home. I was 5 centimeters dilated and on bed rest, hoping to keep my baby in until at least 37 weeks. I had 9 days where I had contractions 1 to 2 minutes apart for hours, but I didn't have a baby. 3 weeks later, at 37 weeks and 5 days, I went into labor. I started having contractions, and that night I decided to take the midwife's brew. This is not me condoning it, I promise. So I finished drinking that at 4:00 p.m. and at 8:00 I started having contractions. They became very close together almost immediately. About a half hour after my contractions started, I started getting ready, I did my hair, and we left. My hospital is an hour away, and with me being 5.5 centimeters dilated at that point, I wanted to make sure that I didn't have a car baby. So we dropped our other 2 kids off with my in-laws, and we headed to the hospital. Got there around 10:00 p.m. They got me hooked up to the monitors. They were seeing my contractions on the monitors. They were checking the baby's heart rate, all of that kind of stuff. It took about an hour for them to get through all of those stupid questions that they ask you. Thankfully, my husband knew most of those questions, so he was the one answering them. At this point, my contractions were 1 to 2 minutes apart, and I was 6 centimeters dilated, which means no way of sending me home. So after they left, I was still in the monitors for a little bit, and then around 11:00, I got into the bathtub. And man, oh man, did that feel so much better. At this point, I was about a 5 to 6 on the pain scale. So getting in that tub felt so nice. About 15 minutes later, I got out and I decided to work through my contractions on the birthing ball. My whole plan for my birth was to go natural, aka unmedicated. I was on the birthing ball for about 45 minutes or so, and then I got off the birthing ball and decided to walk around trying to get my contractions closer together, trying to just dilate me. My nurse couldn't find the wireless monitors, so I actually had to be hooked up to the wired monitors. It really sucked. But I was still able to walk around. I looked at the clock about midnight and I was like, okay, if I can make it 1 more hour, I want to ask to be checked. I was just curious if I was dilated anymore. So I worked through my contractions by the bed, and then about 1:00 I asked my nurse to come in to check me. I was still 6 centimeters dilated. I felt very, very, very discouraged at that point. So I asked my nurse if she could get me the peanut ball so I could lay on my side in the bed to try and dilate me more. After a 3-week labor, I was done. I was done. After all was said and done, I had 60 hours of contractions. So I started using the peanut ball around 1:15 in the morning, and oh my God, that was painful. I started crying, and my husband's like, what's wrong? Like, what is going on? And I was like, it's just so painful. And he said to me, do you want to get the epidural? He told me, like, I will support your decision either way. That man was my rock. I could not have gone through that birth without him. But I told him, like, I'm just going to work through a few more contractions, see how I feel. And at that point, my midwife had walked into the room. She wanted to check me for herself just to see how much I was dilated and to see a plan of action. She checked me. I was 6 centimeters dilated and about 60% effaced, which was frustrating because my nurse had told me that I was 80% effaced. She tells me, you know, you can work through these contractions or we could break your water. There was a very split second in my mind that was like, get the epidural. I wish I had listened to that part of me. But I told her, let's do it. Let's break my water. So we broke my water around 1:35, 1:45. It was something around there. Because of breaking my water, they wanted baby to stay on the monitor for about 15 minutes. Just to make sure that she was tolerating it okay and to make sure that she was okay. 8 minutes later, they checked me and I was 9 centimeters dilated. So from breaking my water, I was 6 centimeters. 8 minutes later, I was 9 centimeters. And my contractions were amped up. At this point, I was about a 10 on the pain scale. My contractions were also coming back to back, which really, really sucked. About 15 minutes later, I decided to get into the bath. I worked through my contraction one time, and my midwife got really nervous that I would deliver in the bath, so she got me out. I wish that I had just listened to my body and stayed in the bath for a little longer. This was about 2 o'clock in the morning, a little fuzzy on the timeline. So I get out of the bath and I work through my contractions at the end of the bed. I'm swaying, squatting, just trying to get the baby in the right position. And honestly, just trying to get to 10 centimeters. After about 15 more minutes, I decide to get up into the bed. And I get on my hands and knees. And a lot of people have asked me, like, was that position really good? And I loved that position. Hands and knees kind of took the pressure off of my body. So I worked through a few contractions and then I felt very pushy. I actually now realize that I was feeling the fetal ejection reflex and that I wasn't actually fully dilated. But no one knew this at that point. So I got onto my side and decided to start pushing. And that came with immense pain, more than I had felt this entire birth. I started screaming and crying, and honestly, I can still hear my screams in my head. That left me with a lot of trauma. I had pushed my cervix out of me. I have a uterine prolapse. My midwife saw it and realized that my cervix wasn't fully dilated. I was about 9.5 centimeters, so I still had a cervical lip, anterior lip to be specific. So I sat up in the bed and just tried to work through my contractions, and actually that position actually felt really good. I was kind of in like a squatting position, but I was sitting. Then my midwife had asked me what I wanted to do next, if I wanted to get the rest of that cervix out of the way, if I wanted to get onto my side. Usually getting on your side can get rid of that cervix. So I did just that. And that hurt so bad. I had one contraction and I couldn't do it anymore. I got back onto my hands and knees, and about 15 minutes later, I started pushing. I started pushing at 252. I started feeling the ring of fire, which a lot of people on this app have seen, which is where the baby's head is crowning. And 4 minutes later, she was born at 256. Because I delivered her on my hands and knees, my midwife had pulled her through my legs, and the cord was wrapped around her arm, her neck, and somewhere else. I think it was her leg. She was completely wrapped up in her cord. My midwife untangled her, and I brought her immediately up to my chest. I immediately turned around into the bed, and I just could not believe how beautiful she was, and like all of the pain just faded away. She wasn't weighed for about an hour. She was on my chest for the entire hour, which has never happened with any of my babies. But she was weighed about an hour later, and she was 6 pounds, 6 ounces, and 17.5 inches long. She was my tiniest baby. I will do a separate video all about my postpartum recovery. That video is going to be really, really hard. But yeah, that was my birth of my third baby. We finally went natural for the very first birth, even though I at times did not want to. Now she is almost a year old. July 5th, 2022 is the day she was born. I still cannot believe it. But this is all going to be about my postpartum recovery. Trigger warning, this does talk about postpartum hemorrhage and birth trauma. So I brought my baby up to my chest, we turned around, and I was sitting in the bed, and I just could not believe how beautiful she was. My midwife had looked down there to see if I had torn, and I did not tear at all, which is the first birth I have never torn on. I could have sworn up and down that I tore. It was about 10 or so minutes after birth, and my midwife had tugged on the cord just to see if my placenta wanted to let go. At that point, it wasn't ready, so she tugged on it about 5 minutes later, and it was ready. I gave like a little push, and it was born. I don't know about you, but seeing the placenta is literally the coolest thing ever. I love seeing placentas. Placentas are really cool. It was about 5 minutes later, and my midwife wanted to pull the bed back a little bit just to assess everything. And while they're doing this, I start bleeding profusely. I had a very split second to realize what was going on before my nurse had done a fundal massage. It's horrible. About 2 minutes of doing a fundal massage, I finally stopped bleeding. I remember in the middle of it, my nurse said to my midwife, like, it's not stopping. I don't usually do this, but I started praying to God. 2 minutes in a postpartum hemorrhage is a long time. I could feel myself gushing out blood. And because I went natural, like I felt everything. After about 2 minutes, they were able to stop the hemorrhage, but the damage was done. Leaving the hospital, we had done some like blood work and everything, and come to find out I was now anemic. So I had to be put on iron supplements. There are so many times within the first 5 or so days that I almost passed out. I was actually in the hospital still, and I went to go bend down to get my charger to charge my phone, and I almost passed out. We stayed in the hospital for just over 24 hours. I was so ready to leave. Also, in the hospital, I did not get like any sleep. My adrenaline was insane. That adrenaline high that you get after having a natural birth is unlike any other. I stayed up for 48 hours. I actually wish that I had asked one of my nurses or my doctor to get me like a sleeping pill or something, because I was not able to sleep. Anyway, about 24 hours later, we were able to leave the hospital, and then about day 4, I started having really horrible contractions. If you don't know, you actually have postpartum contractions to get your uterus back down to size. Your uterus is like this before pregnancy, and then it goes up 1,000 times. So your uterus has to go 1,000 times back down to this. So day 4, I started having horrible contractions. I was actually in the fetal position crying. My husband's like, you need to call your doctor. So I called the on-call nurse, and I was like, hey, I'm just having like horrible cramps, contractions. And they were like, okay, as long as you're not passing any clots, you're okay. I woke up the next morning and I passed a clot the size of a lemon. Immediately called my doctor back, and I was like, I'm passing the clot the size of a lemon. They were like, as long as you're not passing anymore, you're good. I felt very dismissed during all of that. Like, that could have ended very badly. And after I passed that clot, my contractions pretty much went down to nothing. So I'm honestly wondering if it was part of my placenta that was stuck. And my uterus was trying so hard to get that out. I am now a year postpartum. My mental health is doing so much better. But I'm not gonna lie, that was my hardest birth, my hardest recovery by far.